In my journey through life, the words of George Eliot have been an abiding source of inspiration. I was born in Joliet, Illinois, near midnight, June 18, 1841, the youngest of 10 children. My 45-year-old mother, Silence Loomis Ward, was the daughter of a Methodist minister. She cherished the written word and had a clear and certain sense of evangelical social justice. She was drawn to the flames of revivalism. My 54-year-old father, Justice Ward, had musical and mechanical genius. He was quite inventive. For him, one's work revealed one's character. Human progress came with the practical, applied use of knowledge. Both parents had a firm faith in the principles of equality and perfection. They believed that as creatures of God, their purpose in life was to improve it. My birthplace was located on the corner of Joliet Street and Benton Avenue. In 1893, I journeyed back for a visit. Nearby, there is now a street named Ward Avenue. While we lived in Joliet, my father mined in a quarry. Limestone from the pits was used to build churches, government buildings, homes, and the Illinois-Michigan Canal. Later in life, like my father, I too picked, but it was for a different purpose. I wanted to discover fossils, to understand the evolution of life. It is a strange twist of irony that the site of my father's quarry later became the site of the Illinois State Penitentiary. And like I tell my friends, I escaped just in time. In 1842, we moved to a place near Darien, Illinois, where my father set up a sawmill along a stream called Ward's Creek. During this time, my older brother Rast and I were driven with curiosity. We spent a good deal of time wandering along the creek, looking for plants and fossils. Still today, I enjoy walking along creeks. My search to discover has never ended. When I was about 11, we relocated to St. Charles, Illinois, then to a spot just a few miles north called Norton Creek. There my father set up another mill. Rast and I helped with the construction of the mill by carrying stones from the nearby fields. At the time, we did not have much opportunity for a formal education, but our minds continued to be awakened. We learned by doing. The skies, streams, fields, and forests served as tutors. Together we collected hundreds of plants and fossils. We never knew their scientific names, so we coined our own. We created our own taxonomy. You might say we were intuitive botanists and paleontologists. Today, all that remains of the Norton Creek Mill are the rocks we dragged from the fields to build it. The mill is only a memory, a circumstance of the past. The McGuffey readers were my introduction to reading, and with my mother's guidance, I quickly learned that knowledge is power. Meanwhile, my father roused our minds about the earthy, secular side of life, social and political issues. For him, Abraham Lincoln, born of humble origins, was a man who truly understood the painful conditions of American society. He epitomized what America should be, a government that promoted equality and protected the interests of common people. When I was 14, we left Norton's Creek and headed west to farm in Iowa, near my oldest brother, Lorenzo. It was a very memorable experience that took all summer. I enjoyed every minute of it. Under the glow of the Milky Way, I saw my first glimpses of the cosmos. In fact, it may have been the inspiration for my 6th-volume autobiography. Our journey took us to Buchanan County, near a place later known as Ward's Corner. There my father claimed 160 acres granted to him for military service in the War of 1812. Turning boundless prairie into farmland took iron determination. It required hours of back-breaking labor. Nevertheless, my brother Rast and I found time to hunt, fish, and enjoy the freedom of youth. Exploring places like the Devil's Backbone, we encountered yet another world of flora and fossils, and we began to sense simple truths about botany, geology, and paleontology. In hindsight, I feel I was quite fortunate because so many young people never have an opportunity to learn about the environment in which they live. They go through life without ever learning basic facts about the plants and animals upon which they depend for their survival. Despite my father's great expectations, pioneering life brought hard times. The winter of 1856 was colder than any on record for Buchanan County. Conditions were bleak, prosperity elusive. And then, less than 2 years after our arrival, circumstances turned even bleaker. In January of 1857, quite unexpectedly, my father passed away. One never forgets the empty feelings of losing one's father at an early age. Keeping with tradition, my oldest brother Lorenzo inherited the farm. With the passage of time, he became an outspoken advocate for farmers. He detested their exploitation in the hands of unscrupulous bankers and wealthy interests. In the aftermath of my father's death, Mother, Rast, and I decided to return to St. Charles. It was the stage of life when I left boyhood to join manhood. Like other men of that era, I was determined to escape my hardscrabble origins and walk self-made and self-determined. By doing so, I knew I would honor the lessons of my father. When we arrived in St. Charles, my mother moved in with my sister, but Rast and I decided we could take care of ourselves. We settled into an abandoned farmhouse and survived by doing odd chores for a local man named Rufus Smith. By chance, Rufus gave me a book to learn French. It marked the beginning of my lifelong love of languages. Over the seasons of life, I developed a working knowledge of 8 languages: English, French, German, Russian, Greek, Latin, Hebrew, and Japanese. As a result, when I attended academic meetings in Europe, I often spoke the native tongue. Doing so helped me better establish credibility among European intellectuals. During the time we lived in the abandoned farmhouse, Rast and I read everything and anything we could get our hands on, classical as well as popular. One book that especially boiled our blood was Uncle Tom's Cabin. After reading it, I became certain slavery was a scourge, the sale of humans was evil, and abolition was the only solution. The summer of 1858 was when I began to write. I still remember the excitement of first seeing my name in print when one of my short stories was published in the St. Charles Weekly Argus. It was titled The Spaniard's Revenge. When I was 17, I received word from my brother Serenus. He was no longer touring the country as a violinist. He met a young woman at Oberlin College, married her, and settled in Bradford County, Pennsylvania. He asked if Rast and I would work for him in a wagon hub business. Figuring it was an opportunity, we headed east. Traveling by foot for over a month, we arrived with great expectations. In our eyes, Bradford County was a hotbed for progressive thinking. It was the home of U.S. Representative David Wilmot, an outspoken opponent of the expansion of slavery into newly acquired U.S. territories. It was the inspirational setting for Philip P. Bliss, a noted American hymn writer and gospel singer, and for a short time, it kindled the spirit of the songwriter Stephen Foster. During his early teens, Foster lived in Bradford County while attending the Athens Academy at Tioga Point. In its cultural milieu, Foster wrote his first composition, the Tioga Waltz. The Camptown Races, a later song of Foster's, was also based upon a place in Bradford County. Other progressive leaders from the region included Scott Nearing, a social reformer who was fired by the University of Pennsylvania for his vigorous denunciation of child labor, and William B. Wilson, a highly respected labor leader who was recently appointed to be the first U.S. Secretary of Labor. As a young boy working in coal mines of Pennsylvania, Wilson was described as an imp of darkness. Later, when he was only a teenager, he was blacklisted for his attempts to organize a union. I should also note that my cousin, Justin Loomis, was the president of Bucknell, a university located just south of Bradford County. Reading his books on physiology and geology fostered my interest in science. Despite the progressive setting of Bradford County, I soon discovered that hard work alone does not bring success. Individuals cannot control broad economic and social forces. The 1858 recession took its toll. With too many hubs and too few buyers, the business floundered, then failed. I learned a hard lesson about the economics of raw capitalism. After bankruptcy, Serenus left the area and worked as a reporter for Horace Greeley, the founder and editor of the New York Tribune, who vehemently opposed slavery, monopolies, and the exploitation of women and the working class. While working as a correspondent, Serenus was sent to Europe, where he met and shared ideas with the social reformer Karl Marx. Attacking capitalism, Marx contended that history is economics in action, and he argued for merciless criticism of everything existing. Agreeing with Marx, Serenus later wrote several widely read books on social reform. They included A Labor Catechism of Political Economy, The Ancient Lowly, and The Equilibration of Human Aptitudes. I agreed with Serenus and Marx about the ugly social consequences of laissez-faire capitalism. However, their ideas about social reform were more radical than my own. I felt they overly emphasized the role of economics while neglecting sociological and psychological forces. After the hub business failed, Rast also left Bradford County. He went west to study at the University of Michigan and remained there until joining the Union Army during the last days of the Civil War. With the departure of Serenus and Rast, the circumstances of life put me on another path, and to better understand my coming of age, on July 4th, 1860, I began to write a journal, a diary that I continued for the rest of my life. Initially, I wrote the journal in French in order to learn its nuances. To get by, I worked as a farmhand. Doing so, I learned a lot about the uncertainties of nature. My experiences taught me nature is often cruel and chaotic. To be successful, a farmer needs the help of science and technology, better seeds, plows, fertilizers, irrigation, and so forth. Turning from farm work, I decided to take a job as a rural school teacher. I became ever more conscious of two fundamental facts: the chasm of opportunity between the rich and the poor students, and the failure of poor parents to see education as a key for improving their children's lot in life. I also learned about the challenges of teaching. When I first taught, I whipped a few students because I believed it was necessary to establish discipline and classroom control. But after a few months, I found positive measures were more effective motivators. I learned the art of teaching. In the fall of 1861, I persuaded leaders of the Susquehanna Collegiate Institute of Bradford County to let me take classes. The classes were an intellectual awakening. Debates were a core part of the learning process, and virtually every topic left a lasting imprint on my mind. For example, that the U.S. should be afraid of the power of an aristocratic class. That circumstance has done more than genius to make great men. That a hypocrite is of lower character than a liar. That there is more happiness to be found in the world than misery. And that children owe little to parents because they are conceived as accidents of passion rather than choices of reason. I relished competing against the sons of the privileged, especially when I won. It helped me overcome the insecurities of growing up poor. Besides becoming mentally alive, by the age of 19, I also became more emotionally alive, especially after I met a young woman. Lizzie was the daughter of a poor shoemaker, yet she had a rich intellect. Like me, she worked as a rural school teacher, and we shared the same values. In my eyes, Lizzie was the ideal woman, the perfect one, and soon she became the girl in my diary.
I encouraged Lester to serve our country in its hour of peril. I said to myself, if Lester is killed, I would be honored to be his widow.
I was sad to leave Lizzie, but eager to serve. I believed the war was necessary to preserve the Union, abolish slavery, and defend democracy against aristocrats. The first test of my beliefs, my baptism of fire, occurred in December 1862 at the Battle of Fredericksburg. In the midst of the intense battle, I sensed the glory of war. I boiled with desire to kill and defeat the evil enemy. But as the battle raged on, the beautiful dream of victory became an ugly nightmare. Hearing the horrific echoes of war, the endless wailing of the wounded, and seeing death strewn across once beautiful acres crushed any glimpse of glory. When it was finally over, about half of our original company of 1,000 men were either killed or wounded. Yet what I was fighting for, I never doubted. So when the call came for the next battle at Chancellorsville, I was once again willing to fight. Like Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville was brutal and bloody, and again over half of the 417 of us who entered the battle were killed or wounded. I was wounded during the peak of fighting when a bullet ripped through the upper part of my right knee. As I fell, in a poetic moment of irony, a flag bearer in front of me was also shot. As he stumbled to his death, folds of his flag gracefully enshrouded me while I laid in anguish. I tried to get up and fight, but I was shot again, then captured. For 10 days, death beckoned. Then the tides of the fighting turned, enemy lines were overtaken, and I was rescued. In the aftermath, I was carried on a stretcher to the Fairfax Seminary Hospital. I remained there until I was well enough to be sent home to Bradford County for recuperation. I felt fortunate to have survived. In November of 1863, I had sufficiently recovered to return to Fairfax. Occasionally, I needed a wheelchair, but I remained at Fairfax for about a year, working among the wounded.
After Lester's recovery, I joined him at the hospital. There I worked as a nurse. Although it was not a very pleasant situation, it did allow Lester and I to be together. In March of 1864, I found myself pregnant. Under normal circumstances, we would have been very happy. But at the time, we knew we could not properly care for a child. So I took a remedy. It worked.
I believe the war did move America toward a more democratic society, but it was fought on the backs of the poor, and the cost was almost unbearable. 618,000 Americans, one of every 50, were killed. For myself, it was especially tragic because my brother Rast died of wounds suffered during the very last week of the war. I had encouraged Rast to join the Union Army. Throughout my life, I have tried to repress memories of the war. I have never had any interest in celebrations, reunions, reenactments, or stories that tempt people to romanticize war. I feel one must avoid the trap of believing there are winners and losers. A war starts, a war ends, but no one wins. Upon being discharged in November of 1864, Lizzie and I decided to stay in Washington. I felt I deserved a government job because I had bled to preserve the Union. I was especially desperate for work because Lizzie was once again pregnant. For 6 months, I called upon congressional representatives, wrote to cabinet secretaries, even to President Lincoln. I badgered until I received an appointment to a clerkship at the Treasury Department. Then, with fresh feelings of success, about a month later, my son Roy was born. In the year that followed, it seemed I had just about everything in life I wanted: a loving wife, a son, a job, and an opportunity to attend college. But, as Plato cautioned, quite suddenly, contentment may be swallowed up. After Roy's death, Lizzie and I turned to the memory of Lincoln. Like us, he too had lost a son, and it was the memory of Lincoln's courage in dealing with the death of his son during the darkest days of the Civil War that helped us cope with our loss. I never had another child. In January of 1867, I was transferred to the Bureau of Statistics to do a lot of tedious, inconsequential work. One could say I had to sell my soul to pay my debts. Nonetheless, despite its shortcomings, the job enabled me to continue night school, get a degree, and pass the bar exam. Later, I was also certified to practice medicine and eventually granted an honorary doctorate from Columbia College. During this time, Lizzie taught in a school for ex-slaves, and both of us were involved in the early development of Howard University. We were hopeful and enjoyed our new prosperity. We bought a new checkering piano which Lizzie played, while I played the violin. We attended meetings about temperance and women's suffrage, and we read many books on the emerging ideas of social philosophy and science. In 1870, I became editor of the Iconoclast. Unfortunately, its harsh confrontational attacks on superstitions and religious beliefs were far too radical for most people, so within 2 years, the paper was defunct. My experience as an editor taught me that when advocating for social reform, it is more effective to use subtle methods than frontal assaults. Around this time, I also began my lifelong affiliation with the Unitarian Church. Along with Lizzie, I was attracted to Unitarianism because of its belief in the role of reason. Unitarians seemed to be sensible about religion. Unlike so many Christian leaders, the Unitarians did not seem to be hypocritical and righteous in their beliefs and behavior.
Lester and I witnessed the hypocrisy of pious Christianity in our own home. We needed money to pay our debts, so we boarded a young man who was preparing to become a minister. He seemed pleasant and spoke as an abiding, moralistic Christian, but after living with us only a short time, he impregnated a young negress who was our domestic. When Lester found out, he appealed to the young man. He asked him to assume responsibility and support the mother and child, but instead, without regard, he slipped away, shamelessly continuing his high-minded religious training, and eventually graduated from the Yale Divinity School. The situation infuriated Lester. The young man went scot-free, while the mother and child became victims of gross social inequities. It was a tragic example of the oppression of a woman by a man, the oppression of a black by a white, the oppression of a person of poverty by a person of privilege, and the oppression of one who did not have educational opportunity by one who had its advantage.
March 25th, 1872, was one of the most sorrowful days of my life. After Lizzie was unexpectedly stricken with appendicitis, she suddenly passed away. Losing her was devastating. Life became a blank, mechanical existence. To rid my depression, I tried to write, but it was only in vain. Nothing flowed from my pen. For solace, I turned back to the joys of my early life. Day after day, I took long walks along the Potomac, gazing at flora and fossils, intrigued by nature. This continued for about a year until I met Rose Simons Pierce, a young widow who was living in Washington with her father. In her presence, I found relief from my sorrow, feelings toward her that I would describe as fresh, fluttering sensations of joy. Within a few months, we were married. With Rose's encouragement, my childhood fascination with botany was rekindled. At the time, botany had little respect within science, but I felt special dignity in studying the more humble forms of life. By identifying the diversity of plants in a tiny field, I developed a deeper appreciation of the diversity of people. And by observing the transformation of a seed into a flower over a short time, I was better able to envision the evolution of life over a longer time. As a botanist, I have had many memorable moments. Let me share just a few. In 1875, I journeyed to Utah to collect plants for an exhibit at the Philadelphia Centennial. While there, I wrote a series of letters to the New York Tribune, hoping to spark more public interest in protecting and preserving the natural environment. In one letter, I described my emotions while standing on a peak near the Dirty Devil River. I wrote, "I am filled with an inexpressible feeling of mingled wonder and delight. Inwardly I exclaim, 'Ah, nature! I have at last found thee unmixed with art. No house, no curling smoke shall here remind me of the presence of man. No bell shall break the silence of this virgin spot.'" Another memorable moment occurred in the spring of 1876, when I discovered a previously unidentified willow tree along the Potomac River near the Chain Bridge. Subsequently, it was named the Wardian willow, and the specimen I collected for identification still remains at the Smithsonian. In 1881, the National Museum published a guide to the flora of Washington and vicinity. It was based upon the flora I collected. Hopefully, the guide will be used as a reference for future environmentalists assessing environmental changes in the Washington area. It will be interesting to know if any of the flora become extinct over the next 100 years. Finally, I would like to note my work in developing botanically related definitions, appearing in the Century and the Webster Supplemental Dictionaries. Within the list of new words, ecology was one of the notable entries that I added to the dictionaries. I defined it as the science of the relations of organisms to their environment. Throughout much of my career as a government scientist, I had a close association with John Wesley Powell. In 1869, he became the first white man to lead an expedition down the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon. In turn, he became a national hero. Many people respectfully referred to him as Major Powell. In 1874, the Major and I first met at the Potomac Side Naturalist Club, and we quickly became friends. Later, we were instrumental in organizing the Cosmos Club. During the late 1800s, it became a gathering point for influential intellectuals and government scientists. The Major and I shared a common heritage. Both of us born in Illinois, and both of us had been wounded in the Civil War. In fact, he lost his right arm. Both of us believed in the importance of the Darwinian science, and we were strong proponents for a progressive government. If ever there was a man whom I could say I loved, that man was Major Powell.
I feel that Lester Ward is one of my closest friends. To recognize his abiding inspiration and his very compelling influence upon my thinking, I decided to dedicate Truth and Error to him. I consider the book to be my magnum opus on science.
During the 1880s, like my father, I too began to dig in pits, but unlike him, I did not quarry. Instead, I picked to find fossils. I wanted to see glimpses of life as it existed millions of years ago. I hoped to discover evolutionary links to life's dim and distant past. My work as a paleontologist began in 1881 when Major Powell appointed me to the Division of Fossil Plants of the U.S. Geological Survey. 10 years later, after extensive research, I was promoted to Chief Paleontologist for the survey, and I served in that capacity until 1905. I took numerous exploratory treks throughout the United States and prepared annual government reports. My major publications included a sketch of paleobotany, a synopsis of the flora of the Laramie group, the geographical distribution of fossil plants, the Potomac Formation, some analogies in the lower Cretaceous of Europe and America, the Cretaceous formation of the Black Hills, a description of a new genus and 20 new species of fossil Cicadian trunks from the Jurassic of Wyoming, and status of the Mesozoic floras of the United States. While digging in the pits and finding fossils, I became even more certain about the Darwinian theory of evolution and increasingly skeptical of the traditional biblical account of creation. Looking at the fossil evidence, I did not find any God lurking in the past, nor great force wisely directing the evolution of nature. I did not find any overall plan or purpose in nature, no order based upon rationality, no steady or certain path of progress. Instead, I concluded that in the evolution of over 300 million years, nature was boldly chaotic and mindless. I found fossils of flora and creatures extinct without any clear logic or reason or benefit. I saw terrible waste and inefficiency in the cruel competition of nature. Survivors in the struggle were not necessarily the best, nor the fittest. Yet, despite my grim conclusion, I felt inspired to continue to dig, and with each new discovery, I enjoyed a fresh desire to uncover yet another fossil. I felt compelled, driven to uncover yet another link in the gaps of evolutionary evidence about our ancient ancestors. In fact, at times struck with a bit of amusement, I could even imagine seeing ancient faces in the fossils. As a public sociologist, I became an advocate for the protection and preservation of the natural treasures of our environment. I had seen firsthand the wanton private exploitation and destruction of paleontological sites, and I believed that as a scientist I had a duty to promote government intervention in the public interest. In fact, in this respect, perhaps my most significant contribution was a report I prepared on the need to save the petrified forest. In 1905, President Theodore Roosevelt used the report to advance legislation to preserve the forest as a national park. Coinciding with my work as a paleontologist, I was fascinated by burgeoning social and economic ideas, and I became ever more attracted to the emerging field of sociology. From my perspective, the same scientific rigor used to study ancient, non-human fossils could also be applied to study human societies. As a paleontologist turned sociologist, I felt I could avoid the common fault of many social philosophers, which I refer to as the illusion of the near. That is, looking at society in a relatively short span of human history, rather than its development over thousands of years. Guided by knowledge I had learned as a paleontologist, I felt I could develop concepts and theories that were not erroneously shaped by historically immediate and dramatic societal conflicts, and I could avoid the limits of ideas based primarily upon Euro-American cultures. In 1883, I published my first major work in sociology. Initially, I was going to title it The Great Panacea, because I had concluded that education was the key to social reform, but eventually it was entitled Dynamic Sociology. I dedicated the book to Major Powell, in recognition of his close friendship and his generous support of my intellectual efforts. The 2 volumes of Dynamic Sociology extended the work of Auguste Comte, the recognized founder of sociology, and Herbert Spencer, a renowned British social theorist. When I first encountered the concept of sociology in Comte's Cours de philosophie positive, I was immediately attracted to it. I was drawn to Comte's quest to systematize knowledge of social history and his rejection of traditional theological explanations of the social order. Like Comte, I too view sociology to be the most complex discipline in the hierarchy of the sciences, a synthesis of mathematics, astronomy, physics, chemistry, and biology. Like Comte, I see sociology to be at the summit of all the sciences. With Spencer, I was intrigued by his principles of sociology. I was impressed by his treatment of society as a social system that could be rationally explained in terms of scientific laws. Moreover, I admired his uncanny talent for marshalling ideas. Yet, despite their intellectual brilliance, both men offered little hope for social reform. Like many truly great minds, both men were wedded to errors as well as truths. Comte envisioned the emergence of an aristocratic, scientifically informed priestly class to guide society, whereas I envisioned the development of an egalitarian and democratic social order based upon universal scientific education. Spencer was fatalistic in his approach. He saw social evolution as a blind, sluggishly inevitable, biologically driven natural process, one that humans must passively, often painfully, accept. In contrast, I view social evolution as a dynamic, synergistic process that is forever beginning, a process that can be actively guided by human intelligence. Spencer applied Darwin's principle of natural selection to understand social selection in human society. He contended that dominance by particular social classes or races reflected their natural superiority. The fittest social groups survive, while the weakest die. By contrast, I reject the idea of natural group superiority and believe intervention is clearly necessary to assure equal opportunity in the process of social selection. Spencer advocated a laissez-faire society crowned with rugged individualism without government intervention. By contrast, I contend there is a need to have social regulations to balance public and private interests. For Spencer, an expansion of government would lead to paternalistic do-gooders, pushing their plans without adequate knowledge and thereby eroding individual liberty. For me, an expansion of government will protect and enhance individual opportunities and thereby enhance the democratic process. Among American sociologists, William Graham Sumner has become the most ardent advocate of Spencer's ideas, or what is now called social Darwinism. At the same time, I have become one of its harshest critics. In the same year that Dynamic Sociology was published, Sumner published What Social Classes Owe Each Other. His book remains quite popular among privileged people, but I remain confident that in the competition of conflicting ideas, mine will survive the test of time. Two of the core concepts put forth in dynamic sociology are synergy and telesis. From my perspective, what exists evolves. Nature destroys only to build again. Synergy is the principle that explains all organizations and creates all structures. In society, synergy refers to the systematic working together of opposing forces. It is a creative synthesis of balancing of the forces of competition and cooperation. In my perspective, social progress evolves through the unending assimilation of conflicting ideas. Telesis refers to the intelligent control of societal development to attain social goals. It is driven by the force of education and works for the expansion and distribution of knowledge. In fact, the whole tenor of dynamic sociology, its leading thesis and paramount contention, is for compulsory universal education to become the one clear, overshadowing, and immediate social duty to which all others are subordinate. Like John Dewey, I see education as much more than a training or preparation for life. It is life itself. As a child, I read in the McGuffey Reader, "Knowledge is Power, the Fountain of Human Liberty." I feel hopeful that universal education will eventually replace conflict and war as the dominant force of social progress. During the first 7 years after its publication, dynamic sociology was virtually ignored. In fact, only about 500 copies were sold, and I began to wonder whether or not I had made a serious mistake, especially since I mortgaged our house to help pay for its publication. But then came breakthroughs. In 1890, Albion Small, the president of Colby, brought it to the public eye when he selected it as his text for the first American course in sociology. And 3 years later, in 1893, interest grew further when Small founded the first department of sociology at the University of Chicago. In 1895, Small continued to promote it when he established the first major journal of sociology in the United States. In fact, he invited me to contribute a series of articles and serve as an advisory editor. Finally, it should be noted that international attention to dynamic sociology was sparked after the Russian Imperial Council of Ministries ordered all copies of the book burned because of its inflammatory ideas. It is indeed ironic that when a book is burned, its ideas spread like wildfire.
Despite a few disagreements with Ward, I've often said I would rather have written dynamic sociology than any other book ever written in America.
Shortly after reading Dynamic Sociology, I had an opportunity to meet Ward at the Cosmos Club in Washington, D.C. Upon seeing him, I gazed in awe, admiring his strongly molded features. It was like meeting Aristotle. Later, I had the wonderful pleasure of being introduced to Rosamund Simons, a niece of Lester's wife. We soon courted, then married. Lester and I became very close friends, and I began calling him Uncle Lester. Rosamund and I named our son after him, and I dedicated social control to him.
In 1893, Psychic Factors of Civilization was published. I wrote it in just 3 months, but I regard it as my best book. Within its pages, I challenged Spencer's idea that the study of human society should be based on biology. Instead, I argue it should be based on psychology, a study of the mind. My basic thesis is that the mind is the great lever of all things. It is the most powerful force in the achievements of civilization. I would divide the mind into 2 parts: the subjective, which is the source of feelings, desires, and emotions, and the objective, which is the source of intellect and reason. Feelings, desires, and emotions are the driving forces of social progress, while intellect and reason determine its direction. To put it more poetically, imagine humanity as a ship sailing on a quiet but sometimes turbulent sea. Feelings are the winds blowing the ship's sails, while intellect is the rudder guiding and directing it. I believe that by studying psychic factors of civilization, the forces of human behavior will be more fully understood. Furthermore, I believe that with the use of such knowledge, meliorism will become the operating principle of society, and a sociocracy will eventually evolve. Let me briefly explain each of these ideas. In simple terms, meliorism is the improvement of human society through science. It is humanitarianism minus all sentiment. It is the betterment of social conditions through the cold calculation of enlightened thought. As a meliorist, I am not content to just alleviate pain and suffering caused by social conditions. I want to eliminate it. Spencer said people are either naturally happy or not. There is nothing society can do to make people truly happy. Unlike Spencer, as a meliorist, I see happiness as a social construction. It is a creation of social circumstances, and it is most effectively achieved and promoted through an education of the mind. A sociocracy would be the logical outgrowth of meliorism. It is a form of government based upon positive social action. It goes beyond democracy and socialism. Within democracies, there is unregulated competitive individualism. Some people have considerably more opportunity than others. Over and over again, individuals are rewarded for being clever and manipulative, or because they have special access to wealth, power, and privilege. Under socialism, the government tries to equalize opportunity in the competition of individuals, but nearly everyone receives the same benefits without much regard for achievement. Finally, under most forms of government, individuals are not permitted to use their brute strength to threaten and exploit others. Yet, they are allowed to use their brain power for the same purpose. In a sociocracy, brain power as well as brute power will be regulated in the public interest. Moreover, instead of educating people so they can achieve higher status and power, they are educated to improve the quality of society. As I envision the future ideal world of sociocracy, barriers of language, nationalism, and competitive frictions will be swept away, and all nations will be united into one global political organization.
Like Ward, I regard education to be the primary force of social progress. I reviewed Psychic Factors of Civilization for psychological review, and I concluded that Ward gave more to psychology than he borrowed. His ideas about the role of social forces in the growth of intelligence and his observations about sex differences are well worth attention. I do not know of any writer who has made them in so striking and effective way.
In 1899, I wrote a review of Thorstein Veblen's Theory of the Leisure Class, and I still consider the review to be my best essay. Many of Veblen's ideas mirrored my own. Like him, I am concerned about the barbarian status of women, the unproductive, conspicuous consumption of the leisure class, and the widespread exemption of the elite from useful employment. To a large extent, Veblen significantly expanded what I previously called the principle of deception. That is, the use of disguise, sham, and pretense to appear successful to others. Or to put it differently, the use of conspicuous puffery to enhance one's status and maintain power and privilege.
Ward's unqualified approval gave me more pleasure than anything else connected with the theory of the leisure class. I can only hope it will not end up giving me an intolerable conceit.
Pure Sociology, a treatise on the origin and spontaneous development of society, was my third major work in sociology. Fittingly, I began writing it on the first day of the 20th century, and it is dedicated to what I envision to be the emerging era of human society. At first, the book met with icy reviews because it alarmed vested interest, but since then, it has become my most popular publication. It has been translated into French, German, Russian, Spanish, and Japanese. After reviewing it, my good friend Ludwig Gumplowitz wrote, "Pure sociology is more than sociology. It is cosmology." As you may know, he is one of Europe's most respected sociologists, and for many years before his death, we exchanged numerous letters concerning the role of conflict in social development. I felt truly honored when he dedicated his last book to me. As I explained in Pure Sociology, the discipline is divided into two branches, pure and applied. Pure sociology deals with the facts, causes, and principles of sociology, the how, what, and why. It is the lens through which one sees social mechanisms shaping society. It describes how society is driven by natural and social forces. By contrast, applied sociology deals with the practical and public uses of sociology, the what for. It identifies ways to improve social conditions and advance civilization. It promotes scientific lawmaking and social interventions to enhance human happiness. Within Pure Sociology, Chapter 14 has attracted the most attention. In it, I put forth my theory that sex is a life tonic, propelling society and deserving serious sociological study. The chapter outlines my theory about the relationship between the sexes and the treatment of females. Let me focus upon three of my core ideas: androcentric theory, gynecocentric theory, and the gyandrocratic stage. Andro is a prefix referring to male, while gyno refers to female. Androcentric theory holds that in the design of life, males are primary, while females are secondary. For androcentrists, all things center, as it were, on men. A woman is simply a means for reproduction and the sensual pleasure of the male. Androcentrism is based on notions and observations that males are stronger, more intelligent, and aesthetically superior. It is supported by claims that women have smaller brains and have less creative genius. Androcentrists believe that since male dominance is a natural condition, females should assume passive, subservient roles. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, androcentrists believe that God originally made Adam and Eve was taken from his rib. By contrast, I put forth gynecocentric theory. It holds that Eve was the original human and that Adam came forth from Eve's rib. My theory is based upon paleontological, biological, and anthropological data. It avoids what I have previously called the illusion of the near. My theory is based upon evidence of social patterns that have evolved over thousands of years among a wide range of cultures. According to the gynecocentric theory, when humans first evolved, females decided with whom they would mate, and in doing so, they naturally selected the bigger and stronger males. As a result, after thousands of years, by virtue of natural selection, males steadily became physically larger than the females. Yet despite their advantage of strength throughout this early period of human society, males did not dominate or abuse females because they saw them as goddess-like. Males respected females. They were in awe of the female's mysterious power to reproduce. They did not understand that males too had a role in reproduction. This social arrangement of matriarchy continued until males became aware of fertilization and paternity. At that point, when males realized that they too had a role in reproduction, there was a profound revolution in the relationship of the sexes. Instead of continuing to hold females in awe, they began to use their advantage of physical strength to subjugate females. In the millenniums that followed, marital and family rules were instituted to enforce male dominance, and social patterns of mistreatment and sexual inequality widened and intensified. In social settings of primitive savagery, females were often underfed, overworked, unduly exposed, mercilessly abused, and taught to be helpless in dealing with domination. Sons became strongly preferred, daughters neglected, sometimes even killed. Females became defined as property. Fathers sold daughters and bought wives for their sons. Wives were required to take the name of their owner and dress in fashions that restricted their movement. Males enjoyed sexual freedom, while females were suppressed. Increasingly, males were expected to be unfettered by empathy, whereas females were to be quiet and compliant. In many societies, men were allowed to have several wives, but a woman could not have multiple husbands. Women were denied the right to participate in political decisions, as well as to own and inherit property. Their education was limited to knowledge intended to make them better wives, mothers, and domestic workers. In the meantime, myths were conjured up to justify male dominance. For example, one popular idea put forth was that males fight to protect the so-called weaker sex. It is an idea often put forth by androcentrists, but I would seriously question its validity. First of all, males often fight among themselves. Sometimes they even kill each other, not for the protection of a female, but to determine who will get her for his mate. Secondly, it is well known that when males fight in wars, those of the winning side often see the females of their enemies as a booty for victory. Historically, raping the women of one's enemy or taking them as sex slaves has been a tragic but often common practice in the conduct of warfare. And finally, recalling my early experiences as a hunter, I long ago learned that the courage among wild animals is more often displayed by the females than by the males. Faced with the threat of a hunter, it is the mothers who will stay and protect their young, while the fathers flee to safety. It seems to me that humans are like other animals. Mothers, not fathers, are more likely to protect their children. Males fight to dominate. They fight for status, power, and privilege, whereas females fight to protect. Guided by gynecocentric theory, I contend that sociologists must untangle myths that are used to sustain male dominance, and they must foster fresh understandings that recognize women as the social equals of men.
Too long have we been silent, too long have been oppressed. The light of day is breaking, the nation shall be free. For woman is awaking to ask for liberty, to plead for truth and justice, nor shall she plead in vain. She seeks her country's glory and not for worldly fame.
On a positive note, as I look at the changing relationships of men and women in American society over the past 200 years, I am hopeful. Progress in the relationship of the sexes is occurring. In fact, if present trends continue, I envision a new era when both men and women will be wearing nearly the same kind of dress, performing substantially the same roles, and enjoying the same pastimes and pleasures. Despite some social resistance, I foresee a society in which both sexes will be educated alike and accorded the same rights, not only in political affairs, but in the right to control their own persons, their own bodies. Indeed, I see the emergence of what I would describe as the gyandrocratic stage in the evolution of the relationship of the sexes, a stage in the development of society when both men and women are truly free to rule themselves. I have been called a gynocrat. Perhaps it would be more appropriate to call me an optimistic gynandrocrat.
I consider Lester Ward to be one of the greatest living Americans, a man to whom all women are especially indebted and bound to honor. My book, The Man-Made World, or Our Androcentric Culture, is based upon his gynecocentric theory, and it is dedicated to him with reverent love and gratitude.
Women and Social Progress is based upon the pioneering work of Lester Ward. Like he and other progressive reformers, I believe that a mother's table talk is far more important than her donuts and pies. Mothers must be inspirational agents of social change.
I was quite gratified by the inscription Lester Ward penned in my copy of Pure Sociology. He wrote, "To the completely emancipated woman, but one who nevertheless lacks nothing, that belongs to perfect womanhood, and joins with the highest faculties of the mind, the finest qualities of the heart. Brilliant essayist, genial critic, fascinating conversationalist, and charming person. A philosopher withal, who studies and understands the greatest problems of life, man, and society. In a word, a sociologist."
Applied Sociology was my last major publication. In it, I set forth the idea that sociology, initially established as a pure science, is now entering its applied stage, which is the great practical purpose for which it exists. As an applied sociologist, I look upon society as a social laboratory. The role of the applied sociologist is to study, test, and critically evaluate ideas for improving society. Applied sociology challenges the theories of Francis Galton, a cousin of Charles Darwin. In his book, Hereditary Genius, and in an article in the American Journal of Sociology, Galton rejects the idea of natural equality and contends that heredity is a key factor in social progress. He insists that to improve society, it is necessary to control reproduction through selective breeding. He describes his proposal as eugenics. Eu is a prefix meaning good. Genics is the root referring to innate, naturally inherited qualities. Followers of Galton call themselves eugenists, or sometimes eugenicists. In their twofold plan, they contend that society should restrict reproduction by criminals, misfits, defectives, and people of the inferior classes, while at the same time it should encourage reproduction by geniuses and people they deem to be the fittest. I vehemently reject the proposals of eugenists for the following reasons. First, I disagree with their measurement of genius. Secondly, I contend that the potential for achievement is equally distributed among all groups, regardless of sex, race, ethnicity, or class. Third, unlike eugenists, I do not believe that the relatively high birth rate of the lower so-called inferior classes poses a serious threat to civilized society. And fourth, I feel that they seriously neglect the factor of opportunity in their explanations of human behavior and achievement. Let me elaborate. I have often said that every child is a genius, and in every genius there is a child. Galton's notion of genius is much too narrowly defined. In his measurement of genius, he cites examples of individuals who have remarkable abilities to read, write, and figure out mathematical formulas, but he fails to acknowledge the multiplicity of other human talents. Genius is expressed in many forms and in many different frames of mind. Society needs more educated, emancipated, and enlightened minds, not more minds that think the same. It would be socially dangerous to allow eugenists to breed children like cattle. My second objection is that Galton's argument for selective breeding assumes genius is found mostly among white European males of the upper classes. In his biased androcentric calculations, he completely omits women on his list of geniuses, and he regards some races as intellectually inferior to others. In contrast, I feel strongly that the potential for genius is equally distributed within both sexes and among the many different races, ethnic groups, and classes. There are innate natural differences of talent within the respective groups, but few, if any, differences among the groups. My third objection concerns expressed fears about group differences in birth rates. Eugenists are alarmed by the declining birth rate of people from Northern European backgrounds compared to the relatively high birth rates among immigrants, Negroes, and the lower classes, people they allege to be less civilized and more prone to crime. Many eugenists are frightened by what they see as a steady deterioration of hereditary traits of the human population. They claim there is a need to limit the births of people in the inferior groups. To me, such thinking is egotistical and unwarranted. It is rooted in racial, ethnic, and class prejudices. It threatens to erode reproductive freedom and would violate the biological imperatives of nature. Finally, I contend that eugenists confuse differences due to heredity with differences due to opportunity. They attribute to nature what stems from nurture. Humans are not born geniuses or criminals. They are shaped into geniuses and criminals by psychological and social forces. As I have stated before, the practical role of sociology is to find ways to nurture and emancipate the latent intellect found in every person. Nurturing through provisions of equal opportunity is not a coddling of the weak. Instead, it releases a vast untapped reserve of human potential. Given an opportunity to learn, the number of geniuses within a group of poor immigrants will be the same as within a group of aristocrats. All classes, races, and ethnic groups are equally capable of grasping truth. They have basically the same capacity to understand knowledge. The task of applied sociology is to find ways to expand equal opportunity, not to control who creates children.
Truly I am unknown to you, but you are by no means unknown to me. Your argument in applied sociology respecting the capacity of races is my philosophic hope. As a black man, or rather a man, black, I feel that I am indebted to you for your hopeful doctrine that you have given the world, not for my race as such, but for all struggling humanity endeavoring to rise through meritorious effort.
Ward accepted the theory of race struggle, but he vehemently rejected theories of racial superiority. He envisioned a future in which the races shall have all become assimilated, and when there shall be but one race, the human race.
Throughout the course of my career, I have made frequent trips to Europe and maintained a close relationship with many European scholars. In 1900, I attended the 4th Congress of the International Institute of Sociology and was quite surprised when I was elected to preside over the next Congress. It was held at the Sorbonne in July of 1903. In the opening address, I reiterated my position that sociology must be an exact and applied science, devoted to the interests of all without discrimination, and that its purpose must be to provide answers to public necessities, and thereby promote human happiness. I also emphasized that in its application, sociology must foster a balance between the aspirations of individuals and the need for social rules. While in Europe, I had meetings with the noted sociologists Ratzenhofer and Gumperwitz. I challenged them to rethink their ideas about racial superiority and their opposition to the mixture of the races. I argued that every assimilation is an opportunity for a fresh cross-fertilization of cultures and biological types. It is my firm conviction that assimilation serves to advance social achievements as well as physical and mental capacities. In the summer of 1905, I received a letter from Professor Veditz of George Washington University. In it, he proposed a meeting to form an organization of American sociologists. On December 27th, about 50 American sociologists, most of whom were members of the American Economic Association, met at Johns Hopkins University to form a professional organization. After some debate, it was agreed that the new organization should include practical as well as theoretical sociologists. Following the discussion, I made a motion that we break away from the American Economic Association to establish the American Sociological Society. It passed with only 2 dissenting voices. At the time, no one was worried about the acronym ASS, but perhaps someday more sensitive sociologists will want to change the organization from a society to an association. A constitution was developed under the guidance of Professor Veditz. It included a $3 per year membership fee or a lifetime membership for $50. After its approval, Professor Giddings made some very kind remarks about my contributions to sociology, and then he motioned my nomination to be president. I was somewhat surprised, but quite happy to be unanimously elected. During the following year, 115 individuals joined the society, including Charlotte Perkins Gilman, a humanist who had been an inspiration to feminists, Jane Addams, a noted social reformer and peace activist, Louis Post, a civil rights activist and vigorous critic of child labor, who, coincidentally, was a close friend of William B. Wilson, Samuel Barrows, a noted clergyman and international leader of the prison reform movement, and Mary McDowell, a highly respected trade union organizer known as the Angel of the Stockyards. I entitled my inaugural address, The Establishment of Sociology. It is based on my position that the core subject matter of sociology is human achievement. It is not what men are, but what they do. Furthermore, from my perspective, sociology is neither a catalog nor a storehouse of social facts. After all, a mass of dead facts is no more a science than a pile of bricks is a palace. I see sociology as a dynamic science which integrates facts with theory until lifeless bits of information teem with energy. Sociology enables us to orient ourselves. It shows us that society is not a great bewildering maze or a vast meaningless chaos. Instead, it is a product of powerful social forces. Shortly after my election as president of the American Sociological Society, I was granted a teaching position at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. Having resigned from the Geological Survey, I welcomed the opportunity to rekindle the enjoyment of my early experiences as a rural school teacher. The announcement of my appointment to Brown exaggerated my significance to the point of embarrassment, but I suppose it was well intended. After spending the summer of 1906 in Europe, Rose and I returned to settle in Providence. We looked forward to a fresh opportunity to work together at Brown, but unfortunately, Rose became quite ill during our first year, so she went back to Washington to be cared for by her sister, Sarah Comstock. Since then, to cut costs and save money, I have been living in student dormitories, first in Caswell Hall, currently in University Hall. I return to Washington on a regular basis to see Rose, but she is still too sick to be with me at Brown. Since 1908, I have been compiling all of my minor publications along with letters, notes, and other writings into what I'd call a mental autobiography. I plan to title it Glimpses of the Cosmos. Putting it together will be a considerable task, so I'm very grateful for the able assistance being given to me by my good friend Emily Palmer Cape. Mrs. Cape is a very talented woman who surmounted strong opposition to become one of the first women to break the sex barrier at Columbia University. In turn, she graduated with honors.
Some of us called him Dr. Ward or Professor Ward. Others, Uncle Lester, Doc, or just plain Pop. One day I asked if I could take some Kodak snapshots of him. At first he was kind of shy about it, but after some coaxing, he seemed to appreciate my interest. Dr. Ward walked a little hunched over. We called it a scholarly stoop. And he usually wore the same old Civil War style of garb, black from broad-brimmed hat to shoes. He told us a person's wealth wasn't necessarily proof of their true worth for society, nor was the wealth of a nation proof of its social progress. But he also believed that poverty is incompatible with liberty. Most of the time, he was rather unassuming in his manner. He said that when men are most sure and most arrogant, they are usually most mistaken. For anyone who knew Dr. Ward, it was very obvious that he truly believed that everyone should be treated as equals. He never let a porter carry his bags, and he rarely rode a train first class. He said that it violated his belief in the spirit of equality.
I first learned to roll cigarettes from none other than one of Brown's most outstanding professors, Dr. Lester Ward. It was a lesson that few, if any, of the serious-minded Brown professors would have dared to teach. My lesson took place one day after class when I stopped by to visit Dr. Ward in his room. At the time, he was sitting in his big chair grading student papers. While we were chatting, he rolled a cigarette with what seemed to be an uncanny ability for a man of his years, and I was so impressed by his talent that I boldly asked him if he'd teach me his skill. He said, "Sure." When I first tried it, I struggled some, but after patient coaching by the good doctor, I did finally roll one, and didn't do too badly. In fact, he complimented me on my skill. That, however, was to be the last ciggy I mooched from him. I got my own little Bull Durham bag and papers and practiced rolling till I could do it with just one hand. And then I went to see Dr. Ward just to show off my virtuosity. He gave me a nod and quipped, "Now, don't forget the books, Riley."
I lived in a university hall, just a few rooms down from Dr. Ward, so once in a while my roommate and I would go visit with him. On the wall near his nightstand, he had an old photo of his first wife. He told us he still found pleasure by simply looking at her beautiful face.
I attended the women's college at Brown. One of the courses I most enjoyed was social philosophy, taught by Dr. Ward. He used to tell us, "Error charms, while truth challenges. Look for the glimpses of truth along the wayside of time." When one of my friends asked him to sign her copy of Pure Sociology, he wrote in it, "Whatever's worth being is worth knowing. True purity consists of complete knowledge of real things."
One day, Dr. Ward came into the class and wrote on the board, "The power of social gravitation is what holds the social world in its orbit." As he started writing some more, the chalk broke, and he got white dust all over his black coat. Brushing himself off, he quipped, "Hope my ideas are better than that chalk."
Like many other students, I found Dr. Ward to be an inspiration. I took a course from him called The Application of Sociological Principles. On the first day of class, he said his purpose was to get us to think about how to apply sociological principles and bring about social progress. He reminded us that the world belongs to those who make the best use of it. Never be satisfied with the actual. Imagine the possible, then seek it.
For Dr. Ward, the purpose for studying was not to test a student's ability to feed back memorized information for a test. Instead, it was to plant thoughts, ideas, to linger in the mind and fertilize wisdom.
Professor Ward's tests were challenging. They required creative, synergistic thinking. He asked questions like, why does error always precede truth? Is thought possible without language? Why do some people prefer leisure instead of work? Explain why solving one social problem may create another problem. I didn't always do well on his tests, but I was lucky. Dr. Ward seldom flunked a student.
One day, after talking about the influence of social forces, Dr. Ward recalled some of his earlier work in the natural sciences. As he put it, one can never ignore the power of natural forces. He told us how he was still intrigued by nature, and how much he loved to stand by his window during a storm, just to listen to the sounds of thunder and watch the flashes of lightning.
Dr. Ward treated us as if we were his intellectual equals. We respected him because he respected us. To show our respect, we gave him a loving cup and dedicated the 1912 yearbook to him.
Recently, Scott Nearing and I were invited to deliver lectures to the Federation for Child Study in New York City. My lecture is to be given on January 30th, 1913. As I prepare, I have decided to reiterate my vigorous opposition to the rapidly growing eugenics movement. From my perspective, in their feverish haste to rid mankind of its defectives, eugenists are prone to egotism and fail to understand the biological imperative for natural diversity. Moreover, they continue to propagate misleading ideas about race degeneracy and stir up racist sentiments about the rising tide of color and the passing of the great white race. Sociologists must resist the racism of eugenics and any ideas about a superior or master race. In my lecture, I will explain why euthenics and eugenics are the scientifically sensible alternatives to eugenics. Euthenics is an idea put forth by Ellen Richards, the first female graduate of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. As a noted chemist, she is very well grounded in science, but more importantly, she is an articulate applied sociologist. She defines euthenics as the science of a controllable living environment, a science which seeks to improve society through better living conditions, a pure food and safe water supply, a clean and disease-free environment, a vastly improved system of public education, and expansion of opportunities for meaningful employment for all people, and a balance of work, rest, and play. Along the same line of thinking, my good friend Harry Koopman has coined the term eugenics. He defines it as the study of the welfare of nations for the purpose of developing higher standards of social justice and happiness. My colleague, James Dealey, hopes to further develop the idea. I plan to end my lecture with the following thoughts. There are pessimists who feel society is doomed to hopeless degeneracy. They fear the surging sea of humanity, the swarming, spawning millions, and they are above all frightened by the bottom layer of society. Yet, within every downtrodden group, I see immeasurable promise and potency. It is a fundamental truth that people are equal in all except privilege. The teachers of eugenics, the boasted aristocracy of brains, should recognize that the truly worrisome signs of decadence and degeneracy are found among the pampered rich, not the hampered poor.
He embodied the American spirit. He was a monolith of living granite. His life's journey was an American epic.
He was an apostle of human progress. He led a life apart from circumstantial things. His vision went beyond the orthodox.
He was the American Aristotle, an intellectual titan, a master builder of social thought.
His critique of laissez-faire social Darwinism was a bold stroke, far in advance of the rest of his generation.
He was the social architect of the modern welfare state. He provided the foundation for Woodrow Wilson's New Freedom, FDR's New Deal, and Lyndon Johnson's Great Society.
He had the mind of a sage, the heart of a woman, and the soul of a poet. He was the lantern bearer of American sociology.